The songs remember Godric Gryffindor as a warrior, and the songs are not wrong. But there is one tale the bards never learned, from a wet autumn in the north, when his sword refused the bravest hand in the room and chose the most frightened boy in the glen. Since before dawn the rain had worked at the glen, polishing every stone, turning the track into a brown ribbon of mud. Down from the northern ridge came Godric Gryffindor on a broad gray horse, whose patience looked thinner than his own. His cloak clung darkly to his shoulders. Water ran from the end of his beard whenever he glanced down, and below him 7 cottages crouched beside a swollen burn, their peat smoke flattened by the weather. No one came out to meet him. By the first dry stone wall lay a dead ewe, half its fleece stripped away, one foreleg pointing towards the clouds, as though objecting to the arrangement. Godric dismounted, handed the reins to nobody, and waited until the horse gave up, expecting assistance. Deep marks scored the mud beyond the carcass, each one wider than a man's spread hand, and between them ran a furrow where something heavy had dragged its belly or its tail. Master Gryffindor? The voice came from behind a low wall, followed by the top of a wet brown head. A skinny boy rose just far enough for 2 large eyes and a sharp nose to clear the stones, wearing a shepherd's coat much too big for him, a crooked hazel stick held across his chest. When Godric looked his way, the boy ducked straight back down. "That depends. Have I borrowed money from you?" A pause. "No." "Then I'm very likely him." Reluctantly, the boy stood, though the wall still covered him from the chin down. "They said you'd be taller." "They usually do." Godric bent over the tracks, measuring one with the span of his hand. "People also say I eat iron nails for breakfast. I tried it once. Poor for the teeth." He glanced towards the shuttered cottages. "Where is everyone?" "Inside?" I had begun to suspect as much. The boy's fingers tightened on the hazel stick, rain dripping from his fringe and down both cheeks. It had come before sunrise the day before, he said, and taken 3 sheep from the upper fold, then come back after dark and broken Tam Muir's arm when Tam stabbed at it with a hay fork. He swallowed. The fork broke first. Godric straightened. Across the burn, a door opened 2 inches and shut again the moment he turned towards it. A warm welcome. I begin to see why the creature stays. From beneath his cloak he drew a sword in a plain dark scabbard, newly made and without a scratch on its fittings. Even under the gray sky the hilt caught what little light there was and held it. So quickly did the boy step backwards that his boot slid in the mud. "I don't like swords." A sensible opinion. They are sharp, expensive, and forever requiring oil. Godric laid one hand around the hilt. Beneath his palm, the sword shifted. At first he took it for wet leather slipping. Then the weapon twisted hard enough to wrench his wrist sideways, tore free of the scabbard with a bright metallic hiss, and struck the mud point first. For a breath it stood quivering between them. Then it toppled, dragged itself through the rain like a compass needle hunting north, and came to rest against the boy's boots. Neither of them moved. Water pattered on the blade and ran in silver threads along the fuller, and the boy stared down at it with his mouth open before turning to Godric as though this were plainly his fault. Godric stared back, one eyebrow lifted by a fraction. "Make it stop," the boy whispered. "I have only owned it 12 days. We are not yet close enough for commands." The boy lifted one boot and set it down again, a hand's breadth away. The sword scraped after him through the mud. He moved the other foot, and the blade followed with a faint metallic whisper, its point turning towards him each time he tried to escape. "It's broken," he said. "Goblin-made or not, it's broken." An interesting diagnosis. You take it. Godric bent and closed his hand around the hilt. It came free of the mud easily enough. But the moment he raised it, the blade swung towards the boy with such force that he had to brace his elbow against his ribs. He tried again, turning the weapon across his body, and the hilt bucked in his grip like a hooked salmon, the edge pointing stubbornly back over his shoulder. The boy backed into the wall. He said, "I don't want it. I heard you the first time." Then why is it doing that? If swords explained themselves, armorers would charge even more. Behind them a cottage door opened, and a broad-faced woman leaned out beneath a woolen shawl. She took in Godric, the drawn sword, and the boy pressed against the stones. "Ewan, what have you done?" "Nothing." That answer has never once proved reassuring. Ewan's ears went red. "Ma'am, the sword came at me." The woman looked to Godric. "Is that true?" It showed enthusiasm. "I would not call it an attack." "Would you call it normal?" "No." The word brought two more faces to the nearest window, and a third to the door, across the track. Carefully, Godric lowered the blade, though it went on pulling against his wrist. Mud clung to its lower edge, and the rain washed thin black lines from the steel. "Ewan, come away from the wall." "No." "It may be less awkward if you stand somewhere with room to faint." "I don't faint." A short laugh came from the woman in the doorway. Ewan glared at her, then pushed himself upright with the hazel stick, took one step forward, and stopped when the sword's point dipped towards him again. "I fainted once," he said. "There was a great deal of blood." "Whose?" "A chicken's." "That seems inconsiderate of it." Godric turned the hilt and offered it pommel first. Ewan did not reach for it. His shoulders had drawn so high that the collar of the oversized coat nearly swallowed his jaw, and the hazel stick rattled lightly against the stones. "Take hold, only for a moment." "No." "Then we shall remain here until one of us rusts." Rainwater dripped from Ewan's nose. He wiped it away with his sleeve, stared at the sword, and looked towards the shuttered houses as though searching for someone willing to become him. Nobody moved. At last he tucked the hazel stick under one arm and stretched out a hand with two fingers, pinching the grip as if it were something dead in a trap. The change was immediate. The sword settled. Its weight left Godric's hand so completely that he almost stumbled. Ewan gave a strangled sound and grabbed the hilt properly before the blade could strike the ground, and for a moment he stood with both hands wrapped around it, arms locked, the point trembling inches above the mud. The weapon was nearly as long as he was tall. "I cannot use this," he said. Godric released the pommel and stepped back. "That," he said, watching the blade hold steady in the boy's shaking hands, "appears to be a matter on which the sword disagrees." Ewan held it out at arm's length as though distance might make it belong to someone else. The tip dipped, rose, and carved an uncertain line through the rain. "It's too heavy and too long, and I have sheep to mind." "Your sheep appear to have made alternative arrangements." "They'll scatter." then they have good instincts. His mother came down the cottage path with her shawl pulled tight beneath her chin. She stopped beside Ewan, looked at the blade, then at Godric, without any sign that either pleased her. He is 12, and narrow even for 12. I had noticed. You cannot take him after that thing. I have not taken anyone anywhere. The sword tugged towards the upper end of the glen. Ewan lurched after it, boots sliding before he caught himself, and tried to turn the hilt back toward Godric. But the blade swung north again and held there, rigid as a pointing finger. It knows where the beast is, he said quietly. For a moment, Godric watched the weapon. Beyond the cottages, the ground rose between black slopes furred with heather, and a pale scar of stone marked the entrance to the ravine. Rain veiled the upper ridge, but the tracks beside the dead ewe led the same way. It may know. That does not mean we obey it without thinking. Good. Ewan thrust the hilt towards him. Think while holding it. The instant Godric's fingers closed on the grip, the pommel twisted against his palm, and the sword jerked back towards Ewan so hard that the boy yelped, and the pair of them nearly dropped it between them. Godric let go first. The blade quieted, lying across Ewan's forearms with an air of perfect innocence. His mother folded both arms and looked at the thing. You said it was newly yours. It is? Then it has poor manners. I shall mention it to the goblins. A shutter banged somewhere behind them, and from inside the cottage came the thin cry of a baby, quickly hushed. The swollen burn hurried over its stones as though it wanted no part in the matter. Ewan looked along the track at the shut doors of the other houses, and his mouth tightened, though his knees had begun to tremble beneath the wet hem of his coat. I'm not going into that ravine, he said. No, not yet. The boy blinked at that. You're not making me? I am considering several foolish possibilities. Making a frightened child fight a horned animal is presently near the bottom of them. Near? Let us not become hopeful. Godric drew the empty scabbard from his belt and held it out, until Ewan, watching his face, slid the blade home. The moment the point vanished, the weapon leaned against his hip, as if it had always hung there, and he nearly toppled under the weight, catching himself against the wall with one muddy hand. We will look at the tracks. Only the lower slope. You will tell me what you know of the ground, and I will decide whether the sword is clever or merely dramatic. Ewan's mother reached out and straightened his collar with rough fingers. You come back before dark. I'm not going far. You come back before dark? He nodded without looking at her. Godric turned towards the path and led his horse by the reins, and after a long moment there came the soft drag of Ewan's boots behind him, the sword tapping against the boy's knee at every other step, patient and insistent as they climbed into the rain. Beyond the last cottage, the path narrowed and began to climb beside the burn. Wet bracken brushed the boy's knees and left dark fans across his coat. The sword knocked at his thigh with every stride. Godric's horse followed for a little way, then halted before a stretch of broken ground and would not be persuaded on. A sound military judgment, Godric said, looping the reins around a rowan branch. Stay here and look superior. Ewan glanced back at the animal. Can I stay with it? You may ask. The horse lowered its head to crop at a tuft of grass. He says no, Godric added. They went on beneath the ridge. and the cottages disappeared behind a fold of land. Here the burn ran quicker, squeezing between slabs of black stone and foaming around the roots of bent pines. And each time a raven called from the mist, Ewan's head snapped towards the sound. He kept one hand on the scabbard, though whether to steady it or to stop it escaping was hard to say. Beside the water lay a patch of churned mud. Godric crouched, tracing the edge of a print with one finger, and pointed to a smear of coarse gray hair caught on a thorn. He came down from the ravine, crossed here, and followed the burn towards the fold. You already knew that. I suspected it. Knowing is more expensive. Ewan peered over his shoulder. How expensive? Usually one wet morning and a pair of ruined boots. The boy stayed standing while Godric worked, rocking heel to toe, his gaze wandering up the slope before it fixed on a shelf of loose stone beneath the heather. "Don't stand there," he said. Godric looked down. "Why?" "The ground slips after 3 days of rain. My uncle lost a cart there last winter." "That was careless of the cart." "It went straight into the burn." Godric shifted aside just as a wedge of earth sagged under his boot, mud and stones sliding away to splash into the water below. Ewan jumped back with both hands raised, though he had been the one to give the warning. For a moment, Godric studied the fresh scar in the bank, then looked at him. "Useful. I only know the path. At present, the path appears keen to kill me." They climbed around the broken bank and came upon the remains of another sheep beneath a leaning pine, dragged into cover and open from shoulder to belly. Ewan stopped so abruptly that the scabbard swung across his legs. He turned his face towards the burn and breathed through his mouth while Godric covered the worst of it with a fallen branch and a strip of torn sacking from his pack. "Chicken was worse," Ewan muttered. "A formidable chicken? It kept moving after." Godric tied the sacking in place. "They often object to being killed." Ewan made a small, unwilling sound that might have been a laugh, then pressed his lips together as though it had annoyed him. He did not look at the carcass again, but stared instead at the ground beyond the pine where the beast's tracks vanished among stone and heather. It did not go straight back. "See there?" Godric followed the line of his pointing hand. A trail of bent grass led away from the ravine, curved behind a boulder, and rejoined the path farther uphill. The animal had doubled back and waited above its own trail, and from that place anything following would have passed beneath it. "You notice that from here?" Godric asked. "I watch for foxes." "Foxes with hooves?" "They hide the same way." A low scrape sounded somewhere above them, and Ewan's hand locked around Godric's sleeve. At first the slope seemed empty, only wet heather and stone and mist. Then a pebble came bouncing down to stop beside the covered sheep. Godric drew his wand in one smooth motion and raised it towards the ridge. Ewan had already stepped behind him, dragging the sword around so quickly that the scabbard cracked Godric across the back of the knees. "An excellent attack," Godric murmured. "You have crippled your own side." "Was that it?" "Possibly." "What does possibly mean?" "It means I would prefer you did not run until I know what is chasing us." For several breaths, nothing moved. Then a dark shape passed between two rocks high on the slope, too broad for a deer and too low for a horse, one pale horn showing against the mist, before the creature slid from sight behind the ridge. Ewan's fingers tightened on the sleeve until the knuckles blanched. "We've seen it," he whispered. "That is enough looking." Godric kept his wand raised and listened to the stones settle above them. "Yes," he said at last. "Now we find out whether it was watching us or waiting." They left the path and climbed towards the place where the horn had shone. Godric went first, testing each patch of ground with the end of his wand before he trusted his weight to it, and Ewan followed close enough to tread on the back of his cloak twice, muttering each time that the hill had pushed him. Rain gathered on the heather and soaked through their clothes whenever they brushed past. The ridge above them stayed quiet. "You said only the lower slope," Ewan whispered. "This is still lower than the top." "That is a wicked use of words. I have been accused of worse." The place between the rocks was empty when they reached it. A hollow in the wet grass showed where something heavy had crouched, and fresh claw marks ran across the stone at shoulder height. Godric laid his fingers beside them and frowned at the depth. 4 toes on each forefoot, and each toe ending in a blunt black talon rather than a hoof. Ewan kept well behind him. "What is it?" "Large." "I can see that." "Horned." "I saw that as well." Then between us we're making excellent progress. A patch of droppings lay beneath the overhang, full of wool and bone chips and the glossy shells of beetles. Godric prodded it with a twig, while Ewan turned away and studied the glen below, where the village had shrunk small enough to cover with a hand, smoke wavering above the roofs, and the sheep crowded near the lower wall. The sword at his hip had begun to pull again, drawing him along the ridge towards the mouth of the ravine. "It wants to go there," he said. "I know." "How?" "Your left leg keeps moving without the rest of you." Ewan planted both boots in the grass. The scabbard strained at its belt knot, the hilt angled towards the gray split in the hillside. "Tell it no." "I did. It remains independent-minded." "Then it should go by itself." "Perhaps it prefers company." The boy gave the sword a look of deep personal betrayal. "I am poor company." "That may be why it chose you. Less competition and conversation." They followed the ridge until the ground pinched inward and the burn vanished between steep walls. Ahead, the ravine opened in a crooked slit, broad enough at its mouth for 2 men to walk abreast, then narrowing as it went in. Water ran down the sides in silver lines. Broken pines leaned over the gap, their roots hanging bare in the air, and Ewan stopped several paces short of the entrance. "That is where it sleeps," he said. "You know this?" "The sheep never go near it, even before the killings." Godric took in the walls, the loose stones, the high shelf of earth held up by nothing but tangled roots. "There are worse places for a lair." "There are?" "Yes. Most of them involve stairs." Something scraped deeper inside, then came a wet snort, and the color went out of Ewan's face. He caught the scabbard in both hands to stop its pull. Godric stepped in front of him with his wand level, listening to whatever it was shift beyond the first bend. A stone rolled out of the ravine and came to rest against his boot. "We go back now," Ewan said. "No." "Soon." That is what people say when they mean no. This time it means we leave before it decides to come out behind us. He began backing down the slope without ever turning from the entrance, and Ewan copied him, moving stiffly, glancing over each shoulder between steps. The sword fought him the whole way, tugging towards the dark, until the belt knot cut into his coat. Then they reached open ground, and the pressure eased all at once. The beast did not follow. For a while they only stood in the rain, listening to the burn and to their own breathing. At last Godric lowered his wand and looked down towards the village. "It is not hunting now," he said. "It is guarding." Ewan rubbed both hands against his sleeves. "Guarding what?" "Eat you." Back went Godric's gaze to the narrow ravine where the mist had begun to gather between the stones. "That," he said, "is the question we shall answer without going in blind." At the rowan, the gray horse waited with rain shining along its back. Godric unfastened a leather pack from the saddle and spread the contents out beneath a bent pine, rope, a small iron hook, 2 strips of dried meat, a folded blanket, a dented flask. Ewan watched all of it with suspicion. "You came to kill a beast with luncheon." "I dislike making decisions while hungry. That seems unlikely to be our greatest danger. An empty stomach has ruined better men than claws." He held out a strip of meat, and Ewan took it only because refusing meant standing closer to the sword, which had begun pulling faintly towards the ravine again. He chewed without appetite, tearing off small pieces, swallowing them down with rainwater. His hands would not keep still, so he tucked one beneath his arm and gripped the food with the other. "What was it guarding?" he asked. "Possibly young." The strip of meat stopped halfway to his mouth. "There are more?" I said possibly. You use that word whenever the answer is dreadful. I use it when the answer has not yet earned certainty. A gust shook the water from the pine branches, and Ewan flinched, looking uphill to where the ravine lay hidden behind folds of wet heather. If it had young, he said, they should leave it alone. It came down to the village twice, then moved the sheep. And Tam Muir? He moved slowly, even with both arms. Godric corked the flask and sat back on his heels. A beast that has learned cottages hold easier food than hills will come back. If it is guarding young, it will grow bolder as hunger rises. He broke his own strip of meat in half and gave one piece to the horse. "We may still drive it away, but first I need to know what holds it there." Ewan stared at the sword. "And it needs me to know?" "It appears to think so." "That is not an answer." "No, it is an inconvenience." For a while only the rain spoke, against leaf and stone. Godric took the rope and tied 3 knots along its length, testing each one with a sharp pull, and Ewan sat on a flat rock beneath the tree with his knees drawn up, watching the hands work. "Have you fought many things?" the boy asked. "Enough to dislike it." "My uncle says men who are good at fighting enjoy it. Your uncle has likely met noisy men." Ewan turned that over. His uncle, he admitted, was noisy. "There we are." Godric held out the rope. "Come here." The boy did not move and wanted to know why. "So I can tie you to the beast." Ewan's eyes went wide an instant before Godric's mouth twitched. "That was humor," Godric added. "Poorly timed, perhaps." "That was not humor. That was cruelty with a straight face. A valuable distinction." With the rope, he showed the boy how to make a loop that tightened under strain without locking shut. Ewan's first knot slipped apart. The second trapped 2 of his fingers, the third held. Godric made him tie it again and again until he could do it while looking uphill. "What is this for?" "For the rock shelf above the ravine." "The one with the roots?" "You saw it. It comes down every winter a little more. Then we may persuade it to come down today," Godric said, and Ewan's gaze went from the rope to the hidden ravine. "On the beast?" he asked. "That is the hope." "And where are we while it falls?" "Somewhere else." The boy wound the rope carefully around his hand. That plan, he observed, lacked detail. "It has the correct amount for this stage." By midday, the rain had softened to a fine mist. Godric packed away the food and fastened the iron hook to one end of the rope. Ewan got to his feet with some reluctance, and the moment he did, the sword settled against his hip. They climbed again, taking a higher path along the slope, and this time Godric let the boy lead. Ewan chose firm ground, kept off the slick banks, and stopped twice to listen before crossing the exposed patches between the rocks. At the crest above the ravine, they lay flat on their stomachs and looked down. Below, beside a shallow cave, the creature crouched, broad-backed and gray, one horn broken, the shoulders of a small bull on it. Beneath its belly, something pale gleamed among the bones. Godric narrowed his eyes. An iron trap, old and rusted, clamped deep around the beast's hind leg. The chain of it ran off and disappeared beneath a slab of stone near the cave mouth. And every time the beast shifted, iron scraped over rock, and the jaws bit deeper into the swollen flesh above its hoof. It twisted around to worry at the metal with blunt teeth, then stopped and lifted its head towards the ridge. One yellow eye showed beneath the broken horn. Ewan pressed himself flatter to the ground. "Can it see us?" "Perhaps." "You promised to stop using that word." "I promised nothing of the sort." A low growl came rolling up the ravine. Godric eased his wand from his sleeve but did not raise it, keeping every movement small. The beast's nostrils widened on the wet air, one foreclaw furrowing the earth, and when the chain pulled tight, it snapped its head towards the cave and struck at the stone beside it. "There are no young," Ewan whispered. "No." "Then what is it guarding?" Godric studied the bones scattered under the overhang. Most were sheep, but beside them lay a splintered wooden shaft, the iron head of a hunting spear, a rotted leather strap. Moss had grown over the trap chain, where it passed beneath the stone. "Nothing," he said. "It cannot leave." The boy raised his face a little. "It had come to the village," he said. "The chain is long enough to reach the lower path when the water rises and shifts the anchor. Yesterday's rain may have freed it farther than before." Godric's gaze followed the scored earth where the chain had dragged. Then it came back here when the stone caught again. Ewan looked down at the creature. Its ribs stood out under the coarse hide, and flies moved around the wound in spite of the rain. "So they cut the trap off," he said. "That would be kind." Relief loosened the boy's grip on the grass. "Good. It may also be difficult." The beast lunged without warning. The chain cracked taut. Its horn struck the ravine wall hard enough to send stone chips spinning, and Ewan recoiled from the edge, heels digging into the turf. Below, the creature wheeled towards the cave once more. biting at its own leg until blood darkened the metal. "It will kill us," he said. "It may try." "That is worse than you are possibly." Godric slid back from the rim and settled beneath the leaning trunk of a pine. "The trap must come off, but the thing has been frightened and hurt too long to understand help. We draw it beneath the loose shelf, pin the chain there, and come at it from behind while it's held." Ewan stared at him. "You said the shelf was to fall on it." "I have improved the plan. You have made it more complicated." "That is often how improvement looks at first," Godric said. The boy crawled back from the edge and stood, brushing mud off the front of his coat with quick, useless strokes, and said he would wait with the horse. Godric could cut the trap himself. Godric only remarked that the sword would not wait, and sure enough, Ewan had to catch the hilt before it could drag him a step downhill. His chin trembled once. He bit the inside of his cheek until it stopped. "I hate that sword. It is making a poor first impression. Why did it choose me?" Godric's hand paused over the rope. He did not know, he said, and when Ewan pointed out that he knew everything else, he answered that knowing everything would be exhausting. For once, the reply drew not even the smallest laugh. The boy turned his back on the ravine and looked down towards the village, its roofs dim beneath the mist, and Godric let the silence run on while he fixed the iron hook to a thick root at the lip of the shelf. "At the fold," Ewan said at last. "I hid under the cart." Godric tested the knot. "Tam Muir went out with the fork. My mom shouted for me to help him, but I stayed there until it was gone." Ewan rubbed his thumb over a nick in the sword's scabbard. "He could have died." "Yes." The bluntness turned the boy round. Godric was still working at the rope, his face calm beneath the wet fall of his hair. "You could say I was too small," Ewan muttered. "You were too small. Then why say yes?" "Because you stayed under the cart." Ewan's shoulders tightened. Godric rose, set the coil of rope into his hands, and told him he might stay on the ridge today and pull when called. No nearer. If anything went wrong, he was to run downhill and not stop for the sword, for Godric, or for wounded pride. That sounds like sense. It has visited me unexpectedly. They moved together along the crest until the rope hung over the ravine wall beside the loose shelf. Below, Godric tapped a fist-sized stone with his wand until it took on the likeness of a bleating lamb, then sent it clattering towards the cave mouth, where the false cry echoed between the walls. The beast raised its head. Ewan wound the rope twice around both hands and planted his boots in the wet earth, muttering that it was a terrible plan. "Then we must perform it very carefully," Godric said, and stepped down into the ravine. The false lamb bleated again from beneath the loose shelf, its little stone mouth opening and closing with each thin cry. Chain grating behind it, the beast dragged itself from the cave and lowered its broken horn towards the sound. Godric had taken up a position farther down the ravine, wand raised, one hand resting near the empty scabbard at his belt. Above him, Ewan lay flat at the rim, the rope wound around his forearms. "Wait," Godric called. "I am waiting." "You are pulling." "I am holding tightly." "The root disagrees." Ewan let his grip out by an inch. The creaking against the wet bark stopped, though his hands stayed clenched hard enough to whiten at the knuckles. Below, the creature reached the stone lamb and struck it with one foreclaw. The charm shattered, scattering gray fragments across the mud. For a moment, it only stared at the pieces. Then its head swung towards Godric. "Now it knows you lied," Ewan said. "I had hoped to delay that discovery." The creature charged as far as the chain allowed. Its hind leg buckled under it, but the weight of the shoulders carried it forward. The horn scraping sparks from the ravine wall. Godric stepped aside and flicked his wand at the ground, and a ridge of earth heaved up beneath the beast's 4 feet, turning its rush and forcing it under the overhang. "Pull," he shouted. Ewan hauled with both hands. The hooked root tore free in a spray of mud, and the shelf sagged above the creature, stones rattling down around its back. But the earth held. "It did not fall," Ewan cried. "I noticed." Twisting towards the wall, the beast struck it with the base of its horn, and the whole shelf shuddered. Godric sent a second spell into the cracked soil, splitting a narrow seam through the turf, but the roots stayed tangled together like old fingers. "Again," he called, "wrap the rope round the pine." Ewan scrambled to his knees and stumbled towards the leaning tree. The sword swung at his hip, pulling downhill so sharply that he had to brace a hand against the trunk. He looped the rope around it as Godric had shown him, missed the knot, swore under his breath, and started again. Below, the chain jerked free of a groove in the stone, and the beast gained another 6 feet. Godric gave ground as it lunged, his boots slipping in the water, running along the ravine floor. He cast a burst of white light into its face. The creature reared, roaring through broken teeth, and struck blindly with one foreclaw. "Have you tied it?" Godric shouted. "Nearly. That is a dangerous distance from yes." The knot caught at last. Ewan threw his weight backwards, using the pine as a brace, and the shelf groaned and dropped a hand's breadth, showering both Godric and the beast with mud. One heavy stone struck the creature's shoulder and drove it to its knees, while the roots stretched and began to split. Godric ran in from the side. He reached the trapped hind leg, dropped beside it, wand pointed at the iron jaws, the metal thick with rust and blood, its hinge buried against the bone. "Hold it," he called. "I am trying." The creature heaved upwards. Its shoulder shoved the fallen stone aside, and the broken horn swept across the ravine. Godric ducked, but the tip caught his cloak and spun him against the wall, and his wand flew from his hand and vanished into the muddy stream. Godric, still here. He tore the cloak free and reached for the trap with both hands. The beast kicked, dragging the chain through the mud, and one iron tooth shifted enough to show the raw flesh beneath. Godric wedged a stone into the hinge. Above them, the shelf cracked. "Let go of the rope," he shouted. Ewan obeyed. The pine sprang upright, the rope lashed loose, and the last of the earth came down in a thick brown rush. Godric rolled clear as stones struck the chain and buried the anchor slab, and the beast collapsed onto its side, pinned by the fallen shelf from the hip backwards. What followed was silence, broken only by the rasp of its breathing. Ewan appeared at the rim, his face streaked with rain and mud. "Is it held?" "For the moment." "Is that another possibly?" Godric found his wand in the water and wiped it against his sleeve. The beast had begun to gather its forelegs beneath itself. "No," he said, watching it. "That is a warning." The beast pushed against the fallen earth until the muscles along its shoulders stood out beneath the hide. Stones shifted around its trapped haunches, and the chain rang once under the weight of the shelf. Wand held level, Godric moved towards the hind leg, setting each boot where the mud was firmest. "Stay above," he called. Ewan leaned over the rim. "You said that before. It remains excellent advice. It did not work before. That was poor execution." A breath burst from the creature's nostrils, hot enough to stir the rain off its muzzle. Godric stopped beside the iron trap and studied the hinge. The stone he had wedged there had slipped, but one jaw now stood a finger's width from the flesh, and he crouched slowly, keeping his body outside the sweep of the foreclaws. "Can you open it?" Ewan asked. "With time." "How much?" Godric glanced at the beast's forelegs, digging their deep grooves through the mud. "More than it has offered." The sword began to strain at Ewan's hip. He caught the scabbard with both hands and sat back on his heels, but the pull dragged him nearer the edge. "It wants me down there." "No. That is the first sensible thing you have said to it." "Ewan, listen carefully. Take the rope, move along the ridge, and keep the beast looking at you while I work." The boy went still. "Keep it looking at me." "From above?" "It has claws. They do not reach that far." "How certain are you?" Godric looked up. Certain enough to be standing nearer. That earned a pinched, unhappy look, but Ewan picked up the rope all the same. 3 paces along the rim he went, shaking the line against the stone until the iron hook clattered. At the sound, the beast's head turned. One yellow eye fixed on him, and the broken horn rose inch by inch. "Hello?" Ewan said faintly. "You look dreadful." "Try an insult." "I do not know any. I grew up among shepherds," he added, as though that settled it, and Godric only stared until he swallowed and tried again. "Your other horn was better." The beast roared, and Godric decided that would do. While its attention held on the ridge, he drove his wand into the trap hinge and spoke a short, severing charm. Rust burst from the metal in a red cloud. The jaws opened another inch before jamming against a twisted spring. He set one boot against the chain and hauled with both hands. Above him, Ewan dragged the hook across the rock again. "Look here." The creature lunged towards the sound. Trapped earth cracked down the middle, one hind leg tore partly free, and Godric let go of the chain and threw himself aside as a hoof came down where his ribs had been. "Back!" Scrambling from the rim, Ewan felt the sword pull him the other way, twisting the belt around his waist until he cried out. He fought it for one useless moment, then dropped to his knees and set to work on the knot that held the scabbard. Below, the beast heaved again. The shelf broke apart around its hips, and earth poured from its back, followed by roots, stones, and the buried anchor slab. The chain held beneath the largest rock, but the creature now stood on 3 legs, free enough to turn in the narrow ravine. Godric raised his wand. A red flare struck the beast between the eyes, and it recoiled. Yet the horn swept through the light and caught him across the chest. He hit the wall hard, lost his footing, and fell beneath the creature's shoulder. The foreclaw came down. He twisted, but the talons pinned his cloak and sleeve into the mud, and his wand rolled beyond his fingertips, stopped by a stone. It lay there close enough to see, too far to reach. At the rim, Ewan worked the belt knot loose. The sword slipped from his hip, struck the ground, and slid point first over the edge to land in the ravine between the beast and Godric. For one breath, the boy stared down at it. Then he began to climb. The wall was slick with clay and threaded with roots no thicker than twine. Lowering himself backwards, Ewan searched for footholds with boots that would not stop shaking. Twice he slipped and struck his knees against the stone, and the second time a cry escaped him before he could bite it back. Below, the beast ground its foreclaw deeper into Godric's sleeve, and mud pressed up around the warrior's cheek. "Go back," Godric said. Ewan clung to a root with both hands. "You told me to run downhill." "I am delighted you remember. I forgot the part where I leave you here. That was the important part." Another foothold broke away. Ewan slid the last few feet and landed badly, one ankle folding beneath him before he tumbled onto his side. At the sound, the beast's head snapped round, its yellow eye finding him at once, a string of bloody saliva swinging from its jaw. Ewan did not rise. 6 paces away, bright beneath the brown water, the sword lay in the center of the ravine. Between him and the blade stood the creature's 4 quarters. Against the wall beyond, Godric remained pinned under one heavy claw. The trap chain stretched behind the beast to the buried anchor, rattling whenever it shifted its wounded leg. Ewan crawled backwards until his shoulders struck stone. "Stay still," Godric said softly. "I can do that. You have always shown promise." Down came the broken horn. Ewan pressed both palms against the wall as if he might flatten himself into it, his breath coming through his nose in thin, quick pulls. The creature took one dragging step towards him. Its rear leg failed where the trap bit deep, but it caught itself and came on. Godric reached again for his wand. His fingers scraped mud an inch from the handle before the beast shifted and drove his arm harder into the ground. A sharp sound broke from him. He swallowed it. "Ewan," he said, keeping his voice level. "When it moves, the claw lifts." The boy stared. "What?" "Make it come farther." "No. Only 2 steps, then 1.5. We are bargaining well." The beast advanced, chains scraping over stone. Ewan dragged himself sideways along the wall, boots sliding through the shallow stream, its horn following him. Behind it, the claw pinning Godric's sleeve lifted a little as the creature leaned forward, and Godric tore his arm free. The movement ripped the cloak at the shoulder. Before his hand could reach the wand, though, the beast wheeled back and one foreleg struck him across the ribs and sent him rolling beneath the overhang. He came to rest against the fallen stones, face turned away, one arm trapped awkwardly beneath him. "Godric?" No answer came. Ewan looked from the still figure to the sword in the water. The beast turned as well, confused by the silence, then began limping towards the fallen man. Its chain drew taut and stopped it just short of the overhang, so that it leaned against the restraint, horns scraping along the wall while its claw reached for Godric's boot. Then the sword moved. Its hilt turned through the current until it pointed at Ewan, and the blade slid half a hand across the stones and stopped. He shook his head before it could move again. "I cannot," he whispered. The sword waited. Ewan pushed one boot beneath him. His ankle buckled, and he caught the wall with both hands and breathed through clenched teeth until the pain eased enough to bear. The beast clawed at Godric's boot, dragging him several inches from the stones. One step into the stream, then another, each small enough to hide inside the sound of the rain. Halfway to the blade, the creature heard him. Its head swung round. Ewan stopped with one foot raised, arms hanging uselessly at his sides. A low grunt, and the beast turned from Godric, its chain drawing a black line through the mud as it faced the boy. The sword lay between them. Ewan ran for it. He reached it a heartbeat before the beast did. His fingers closed around the hilt, and the blade came free of the water so suddenly that he nearly fell backwards. The horn swept past his coat and struck sparks from the wall. He stumbled behind a jut of stone, clutching the sword across his chest, while the creature dragged itself round to follow. "Godric," he shouted. The fallen man moved at last, one hand clawing into the mud. "Still here. I have the sword. So I see. Do not wave it about. It is sharper than your stick." The beast thrust its head around the stone. Ewan jerked the blade up with both hands, and the broken horn struck the flat hard enough to numb his arms. He dropped to one knee, teeth knocking together, but the sword did not leave him, its point settling towards the creature's wounded leg. "I cannot kill it," he gasped. Godric rolled onto his back and tried to rise. One arm failed beneath him, and he sank again against the stones. "Then do not fight its head. That is the part coming at me. Lead it to the shelf." "There is no shelf. There is enough." Ewan glanced past the beast. Behind its hindquarters, the fallen earth had left a steep tongue of loose stone beneath the cracked roots. One thick root still bound the upper bank to the ravine wall, stretched pale and tight across the mud, and the trap chain ran beneath it, caught around the buried anchor slab. The creature lunged again. Ewan scrambled sideways, dragging the sword through the water. The horn caught his sleeve and tore the cloth from shoulder to elbow, though the skin beneath stayed whole. He cried out and ran 3 limping steps towards the broken shelf. The beast followed, hauling the chain behind it until the iron links snapped tight around the root. "Farther," Godric called. "I am trying." Ewan backed onto the loose stones, which shifted beneath his boots and ticked down into the stream. The creature lowered its head and came after him, one foreclaw reaching, the trapped leg jerking uselessly behind. He raised the sword, but his arms shook so badly that the point wandered from eye to horn to mud. "Look at the root," Godric said. Ewan looked. The chain had bitten halfway through the root. Each pull opened the split a little wider, showing pale wood beneath the bark, and above it the last section of bank leaned out over the ravine, heavy with rain and stones. The beast gathered itself for another rush. Ewan turned to climb, and the loose ground slid out from under him, carrying him back down towards the horn. He dropped the sword point first into the earth and held on with both hands. Between 2 stones, the blade caught and stopped his fall. For an instant he hung there, boots kicking in the mud while the creature drove forward, and its horn passed beneath his ribs, close enough to lift the hem of his coat. Its shoulder struck the bank. The root cracked. "Cut it," Godric shouted. Ewan pulled the sword free and swung once. The edge struck bark, bit deep, and stuck fast. He dragged at it, sobbing through his teeth, while the beast tore at the slope below him, and the root stretched into a white, splintering rope. The second blow went through. Earth dropped away beneath his feet. He flung himself towards the wall, caught a hanging root with one hand, and swung clear as the whole bank collapsed. Stones and black soil poured over the beast's shoulders and drove its head down. The anchor slab rolled after them, chain wrapped tight around its middle. Halfway upright, the creature fought the mud. One claw broke through, then the broken horn gouging a path towards Ewan's boots. He slid down the wall, landed beside the sword, and snatched it up before the beast could rise. Its yellow eye opened through the dirt. He stood in front of it with both knees bent and the blade held low. His breath hitched and tears ran with the rain across his muddy face. When the beast heaved forward, he stepped in close enough to smell its blood and drove the sword beneath the jaw with both hands. The body shuddered once, and he kept hold of the hilt until the weight beneath it stopped moving. For a long while, he did not move at all. Both hands stayed locked around the hilt, his shoulders jerking with each breath while rain pattered on the creature's hide. The blade had gone in beneath the jaw and lodged against bone. He had to set one boot against the mud and pull twice before it came free. When it did, he stumbled backwards and sat down hard in the stream. Godric pushed himself upright against the wall. His torn cloak hung from one shoulder, and he kept an arm pressed across his ribs as he crossed the ravine. "Ewan," he said, and the boy flinched at his voice. He looked down at the blade across his knees, then at the beast, and turned sharply aside. Nothing came up when he retched, only a dry, painful sound that bent him nearly double. Godric stopped beside him without touching him and waited until the spasms passed. "I told you I was bad with blood," Ewan managed. "You gave fair warning. You stopped answering. I was briefly occupied." Ewan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and admitted quietly that he had thought Godric dead. That would have been inconvenient. A weak noise escaped him, halfway between a laugh and another sob. He pressed both palms over his eyes, forgetting the sword until it slid from his lap and struck a stone, and the sound made him snatch it up at once. Even now, with the creature dead at his feet, the blade rested easily in his grip. Crouching beside the beast, Godric examined the wound, then laid 2 fingers against its neck. He stayed there several breaths before sitting back on his heels. "It is finished." Ewan stared at the muddy water around his boots. "I stabbed it," he said, and then, "I did not want to." "I know." The words settled between them with the rain. Godric reached for his wand, still lying near the wall, and winced before his fingers were halfway to it. Ewan noticed, rose unsteadily, and fetched it without being asked. His ankle nearly gave beneath him on the way back, but he kept his balance by planting the sword like a walking stick. That is appalling treatment of a fine blade. It dragged me into a ravine. A fair defense. A quiet spell eased the trap's jaws open, and the rusted iron fell away from the beast's leg into the stream, where the current carried threads of blood from its teeth. Ewan watched without coming any nearer. His face stayed pale, and every few breaths his mouth tightened, as though he could still feel the hilt striking his palms. They worked slowly after that. Godric freed the chain from beneath the stones while Ewan gathered the rope, glancing at the carcass each time the rocks shifted. Together they dragged the body beneath the remaining overhang, where foxes and weather would find it before the village children did. Neither spoke much, though once Godric asked for the iron hook, and Ewan handed him the entire coil. By the time they climbed out, the rain had thinned to mist. Ewan reached the top first and dropped straight to his knees, breathing into the wet heather. Godric came after with rather less dignity, using a root and several muttered complaints about Scottish hills, and when he finally stood, he found the boy looking towards the village. Smoke rose straight from the cottages now. The clouds had lifted enough to show the far side of the glen green and dark beneath the fading day, and somewhere below a sheep called and another answered from beyond the burn. The walk back took longer than the climb had. Godric limped, Ewan favored one ankle, and neither of them objected when the gray horse met them halfway up the path. At the first cottage, the doors opened one by one, though the boy stopped before anyone could reach him. His mother came through the mud with her shawl loose and seized him by both shoulders. She looked at the torn sleeve, the mud on his face, the sword in his hands. Ewan opened his mouth and found no explanation waiting there. She drew him against her, blade and all, and for one moment he stood rigid before folding into her coat. Godric turned away to give them what privacy a village track allowed, and retrieved the empty scabbard from where Ewan had lost it. He held it out when the boy finally stepped back. It should be cleaned. Ewan looked at the sword. You take it? Godric wrapped his hand around the hilt and the blade remained still. For the first time that day, Ewan loosened his fingers. Without the weapon pulling after them, Godric slid it into the scabbard and fastened it at his own side while the boy watched closely. Apparently, he said, we have reached an understanding. No one cheered as they crossed the burn. Tam Muir stood in a doorway with one arm bound to his chest, and the villagers simply made room for Ewan to pass. Up at the upper fold, the scattered sheep had begun coming back on their own, pale shapes moving through the wet dusk. Ewan stopped beside the wall and lifted one loose stone back into place. His hands were shaking still, so it took 3 attempts to set it squarely. Behind him the sword hung quiet at Godric's hip, its dark hilt catching the last narrow line of evening. Together they walked towards the cottage lights, leaving 2 uneven trails of mud along the glen. No ballad was ever made of Ewan. The glen simply grew quiet again. The sheep came home, and a frightened boy learned that he could carry a heavy thing a long way if someone walked beside him. The sword, for its part, had known that from the first.